Maybe then let's dive into number 2, which is the idea that like God is a unique moral agent.
Yeah, so this one was this objection that me and Tim sort of came up with is a little bit different than the Brian Davies view. So it is similar in many respects, but it's also different. So there's a book by Brian Davies. I think it's called I can't remember the God in the Problem of Evil. I can't remember the exact title because
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like it too well. It
Yeah.
was not like I can agree with some of the motivations behind his arguments, but I was very like, I was like, okay, this is not doing too well.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
so what Brian Davies is gonna say is that that God is not a moral agent at all, right? So God is all good, right? But then, God doesn't really have any obligations whatsoever, right? That's an
Mm-hmm.
extreme position, right? And I can sort of understand the classical theist intuition behind that,
Yeah.
but what me and Tim have come up with is sort of a middle ground approach where, instead of saying that God it has no obligations, right? That's one extreme, the
Mm-hmm.
Brian Davies. The other extreme would be that that God is a human moral agent, right? That God is sort of
Yeah.
constrained by these ethical human moral conditions, right?
Okay. Yeah. I'm
Um,
tracking with you.
and so the middle part, a good middle ground between those extremes is, I think, the one that me and Tim hold to, which is a sort of that God is a unique moral agent, which means that basically that God has unique moral obligations that only apply to him and nobody else. Now, why is this relevant to the problem of evil? Well, there's a few reasons. So number one is that a lot of arguments from evil sort of assume that God is a unique or that God is a human moral agent, right? So like one example is like, okay, let's say that like someone's getting murdered, right? It's like, oh well, wouldn't you want to stop that murder, right? And so because God didn't stop that murder, then therefore, God can't be all good. Well, that argument, that argument actually assumes that God is a human moral agent, right? And the problem is that there's no really good reason for that. So that's an undefended assumption that God is a
Mm-hmm.
human moral agent.
Yeah.
There is one exception though. The only time that I've seen it defended, the only time that I've seen that assumption defended is that if we say that God is not a human moral agent, then theism has no explanatory power because we can't explain, why God does certain actions, right?
Yeah.
But I think the way, at least the approach that me and Tim hold to, which is that God is a unique moral agent, I think that bypasses that problem because we're not saying that God has no obligations. So we're not saying that God has no constraints on him, just that his
Mm-hmm.
constraints are sort of unique to him and that they're not going to be purely, meta ethical human
Mm-hmm.
constraints, basically. I
Mhm.
hope that makes
So it's
sense.
almost like the idea, like you have the skeptical theist that's just gonna say like God's totally unique, like we have no way of knowing like what he may like do or not do. Maybe like extreme form of skeptical theism. And on the other end, there's people who may say like, well, we totally know what God wouldn't do. You guys want to kind of like find like a middle ground? Is that kind of the path
Yeah.
you're trying to go forward with?
Yeah, because in fact, on my video on the problem of evil, one of the first things I go over is this distinction. These two extreme camps, right? You have the skeptical theist, which says
Mhm.
God, we can't know anything about why God allows for evil, but then
Yeah.
you also have this dogmatic, what I call dogmatic theism, which is where we can know everything about why God allows for evil, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
what I found is that the best approach, right, is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? It's going to
Okay.
be in between those two extremes. And what is that? Well, it just means that we can have some idea of why God allows for evil, right? We can have some sort of like, aesthetic and moral, what I call meta normative constraints that sort of guide God's actions, right? So we can, theism in that sense has explanatory power because it can sort of explain why we live in this type of world, right? Why God, allows for certain evils, but it's not saying that we can know everything, right?
Hmm.
So in that case, then I think the cool thing about this approach is that it allows theism to be a research project, which means we're able to learn more about why God allows for evil. So like I admit that right now, like I don't know every single reason why God allows for evil, right? That's a research project, right? We continually learn more about why God, does those certain things. And so yeah, I think what that allows us to do is sort of I think it shows us that theism can sort of be its own research project, right? We can sort
Hmm.
of understand, we can grow our knowledge and why God does certain things, and it can grow our knowledge and just it can grow in knowledge and like the explanatory power of theism, right?